right. Hello, everybody. It is I, Jayme CheeseSlice, and I'm here to introduce the show for today. We're going to talk about the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is kind of a misnomer, I think, because they don't really promote democracy. But anyhow, Jeremy's the expert on that, and he's going to be talking about that. So if this is the first time you have watched Uncontrolled Opposition on YouTube, just to let you know, this is a radio program first and foremost, and we have to record it for the radio. So we're doing it here live, and you can see the entire show done completely uncut. We're going to record about an hour, and then we're going to wrap things up and get out of here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on Gloria and Jeremy, and we'll get the show started. So how are you guys doing?
Great.
Can we hear you, Gloria? We had technical oh, now we can't hear Gloria. We had this problem fixed, and we can't hear her. What's going on? Come on, talk to me, Gloria. So before the show, she had no speakers, so we got that fixed, and we could hear her, and now we can't hear her. Let's try, maybe try dropping out and coming back in. Oh, this is not great. Okay, Gloria's going to drop out and come back in. And we will hopefully have her voice when we come back. All right, come on, Gloria. Sorry, folks. We were troubleshooting this for 10 minutes before we started the show. I thought everything was good. And as soon as the show starts, we lose her microphone. Anyhow, Jeremy, how are you doing?
Jayme, can you stop it and restart?
Not really. No, if it was just a recording, sure. Okay, Gloria's back.
How about now?
Yes, there we go. All right.
Go.
Let's go ahead and take it away. I'll hand it off to you, and you can run with it.
Okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle mind wars with truth strikes. I'm Gloria Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor Jayme Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. Today we will discuss with my co-host, our resident professor and historian, Jayme Kuzmarov, his articles on the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. Starting with his most recent one titled, New NED Board Member is Reactionary Kansas Governor Who Left His State in Carnage and Destruction. The National Endowment for Democracy, NED, can be understood as a CIA cutout that finances dissident media and political organizations in countries targeted by the U.S. for regime change. It was built to legitimize and expand influence operations. Alan Weinstein, a co-founder of NED, is quoted as saying, NED does openly what the CIA formerly did covertly. NED was formed in 1983. For perspective, Ronald Reagan was president from 1981 to 1989. During this time, NED was focused on deconstructing the Soviet Union. Reagan worked with Gorbachev to initiate perestroika in 1985. In hindsight, the majority of Russians consider Gorbachev a traitor for opening the Soviet economy to private and foreign investment, which engendered its fall in 1991. Its powerful union was balkanized into fledgling nation states that were more easily raided by Western corporations with their bribes. When this didn't work, Gene Sharp and George Soros's color revolutions, backed by NED and the CIA, did. Their methodology is to stoke civil wars and remove patriotic leaders and resistance groups and replace them with greedy puppets and death squads. We are seeing this now with Iran. Ned's rhetoric has always been centered on the threat of the bogeyman communists and socialists that seek to take away our freedoms. This unsubstantiated ruse continues to justify election interference and disinformation campaigns funded with our tax dollars. The truth is that the impoverished developing countries like Nicaragua demonstrate, despite crippling sanctions, that they can better provide for their citizens health care, housing, clean drinking water, and quality foods, where our wealthy country willfully won't. With the trifecta of NED, unilateral economic coercive measures called sanctions, and the CIA's violent tactics involving assassinations, kidnappings, torture campaigns, and imprisonments, hybrid warfare takes place, although this is sold to us as democracy. Yes, hybrid warfare done with hybrid warfare done without troop deployment, although private military contractors and criminals are often used, engender civil wars. And these civil wars are called pretty names, like the Rose Revolution, Orange Revolution, or Tulip Revolution. But what they really are is undeclared war. Remember, Yugoslavia was broken into 7 nation states, and 2 of the states, Croatia and Serbia, went into a hot war. Now, as Jeremy explains in his articles, the U.S.'s prime target has shifted from Russia to China. Keep in mind that secondary targets always remain in NED's crosshairs. These secondary targets constitute any developing country that resists the Federal Reserve System, IMF loans, foreign corporate pillage, and gangster capitalism. The Trump administration has arranged some smoke and mirrors for us with the rise of the burn it down narrative, driven in part by figures tied to the Department of Efficiency, or DOGE. Elon Musk publicly called NED a scam and an evil organization, arguing it should be dissolved. Funding was frozen, payments stopped, staff furloughed, operations disrupted. It looked like a takedown. But it wasn't, because structurally the system held. Here's what actually happened. In 2025, the administration attempted to choke off funding, freezing foreign assistance pipelines tied to democracy promotion. NED sued. A federal judge ruled the withholding illegal, citing obstruction of congressionally mandated funds. Funding resumed. Then in 1926, the White House proposed eliminating NED funding entirely, zeroing it out in the budget request. And again, Congress intervened. Not only did NED survive, it received approximately $315 million in appropriations, even after proposed cuts. That number matters because it tells you this. The defunding narrative generated noise, but not outcome. Even with roughly a 40% reduction from prior levels, the core structure remained intact, and bipartisan support held, as it always does for foreign policy. So what was the DOGE moment? It functioned as spectacle, a highly visible attack that created the perception of systematic challenge and change, while the underlying architecture, appropriations, grant networks, institutional partnerships, continued operating. That doesn't mean nothing changed. It means the change was selective. Disbursement delays, legal conflicts, temporary operational disruptions, but not dismantling, not even close. And while the drama played out domestically, the external mission didn't pause. It recalibrated. Media outlets funded through these pipelines continue to operate inside geopolitical fault lines. Academic institutions, like those within Stanford University, continue to legitimize and elevate these actors under the banner of independent journalism. And the strategic focus has moved cleanly from Moscow to Beijing. What remains is measurable. A congressionally funded entity distributes hundreds of millions annually into political, media, and civil society ecosystems across more than 100 countries to keep them in alignment with U.S. corporate objectives. Attempts to eliminate NED failed, even when pushed from within the executive branch. And public criticism, whether from the left or from Dodge-style disruption campaigns, does not translate into structural change. So when you hear defund NED, understand what it actually means. It was proposed, it was litigated, it was blocked, and it was reversed. The system absorbed the shock and continues. The only real shift was not whether the system exists, it's where it's pointed. And right now, as Jeremy explains, it's pointed at China. Thank you. Jeremy, please walk us through your detailed articles.
Okay, well, thank you, Gloria, and that was an outstanding overview of NED. And I would add, yeah, I think there wasn't much activism on the left. I think one reason that they were able to get away with it so easily, restoring the funding, and where were the protests? And I think that's where the Trump derangement syndrome comes in, because there's this fixation with Trump. Again, both of us agree that a lot of Trump's policies are horrific, but the left sometimes loses sight of the bigger picture, that Trump is just a symptom of the evils of the system, and that there are wider problems. And activism, so there should have been, progressives should have been moving to abolish the NED and to expose what it's doing, but they're not. From I think I'm one of the few people, and Covert Action Magazine and the Gray Zone, I think, are the main outlets exposing covert operation, but none of the mainstream left, alternative media ever cast any critical eye on it, and it's not the focal point of political activism as it should be. And it's not partisan, it's bipartisan. It's a mix of Democrats and Republicans. And you can look at the NED board. They have Democratic congressmen on there, like Joaquin Castro, who's a darling of progressives. And he's on the NED board. And he's also on, I have an article today about the House Intelligence Committee, which is supposed to be an oversight body of the CIA. And he's on that. And that exemplified the CIA infiltration of the legislative branch of government, because NED is a CIA offshoot, as you pointed out. It was founded in the 80s. In the 50s and 60s, you had organizations like the Asia Foundation, and we had a program on that. People could consult with David Price, who wrote a very detailed study based on the record he was able to gain, because they deposited a lot of their records at the Hoover Institute, and he reviewed that and wrote a very illuminating book. And he showed how it was deeply connected with the CIA, and that's how it was kind of the soft power arm of the U.S. empire, and promoted all these educational programs in Asian countries, but also in the United States, because it was bringing Asian anti-communists to American universities. It was employing American professors. And that is another aspect. And I have an article forthcoming, will be out in August, about how many professors in American universities are connected with the NED, and they're not objective academics, and they're promoting propaganda on American campuses, teaching our students. So generally, the NED does target foreign country. They provide grants and loans to civil society organizations. It all sounds very nice, devoted to human rights or free media, but really they're targeting governments that the U.S. wants overthrown, socialist governments, independent-minded governments that want to gain control over their own country's natural resources or establish their economic sovereignty. And then the NED will fund media organizations that are not objective media organizations. They're propaganda outlets that will demonize that particular government and focus on alleged corruption or autocracy in that government. I did an article on Bangladesh because Stanford University, and it should be noted that Stanford is one of the worst campuses as far as the NED present, because I did a study, again, it'll be published in August, of NED professors, and I found them everywhere. But Stanford had the most. The Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford is dominated by NED. There's many people on the board of the NED Journal for Democracy, such as Michael McFaul, who's a leading Russophobe and Ukraine war hawk, who was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow. Condoleezza Rice is associated with the NED. She is a professor at the Freeman Spogli Institute. Larry Diamond, who is the founder of the NED Journal of Democracy. Francis Fukuyama, who's on the board of NED, is a famous neoconservative writer. These are just some well-known examples, as well as they take Iranian exiles who push for regime change. They're on the faculty at Stanford. And then Stanford gave an award to a Bangladeshi outlet that was financed by NED called Netra News. And I reviewed Netra News to see what kind of news outlet this was. And I have training in journalism, and I found this was not a news outlet. This was a propaganda outlet to support the U.S. regime change operation, because not many people are that aware that the U.S. supported this regime change operation a couple years ago now in Bangladesh to oust the Sheikh Hasina, who is a pro-Chinese leader, who is the granddaughter of the founding father of Bangladesh. And she oriented the Bangladesh more toward China. So the U.S. wanted her removal. I'm not to say she's a perfect leader. I mean, there are problems with their leadership, but any independent newspaper could legitimately focus on that corruption or some autocratic features. But what marks it as a propaganda outlet was the fact that it didn't. Then the U.S. helped facilitate the regime change operation that brought in a guy named Muhammad Yunus, who is this neoliberal darling who was tied with the Clinton Foundation. And he had supported the microfinance scheme that supposedly would eradicate poverty, but actually were placing farmers in great debt, and is really kind of a Ponzi scheme. So this is a very corrupt guy, and the global elite liked him because his remedy of microfinance mean they don't have to promote traditional leftist remedies for curbing poverty. Would be things like raising taxes on the wealthy, nationalizing industry, land reform, paying higher wages, better labor laws, minimum wage, more funding for education, healthcare. That's what the global elite does not want, because that means they have to pay more taxes. They have to pay their workers more. They offshore those companies from the U.S. so they don't have to pay union wages here in the United States. They don't want to have to pay union wages in Bangladesh. So they don't want a leftist or land reform. The rich don't want that. They own a huge amount of land. So they like Yunus's approach. And it happened to be a crook who indebted, their documentaries exposing and investigations that many people committed suicide because they took these loans and they had to pay them back within 7 days. You can't build a business in 7 days. And he charged huge interest rates, and they fell in debt and they lost everything. A lot of them were very poor to begin with. But that wasn't reported. So to my point about NED, is in this Netra News, then he came in power and he used these Muslim gangs to help solidify his power, and he was empowering Muslim extremists. So the human rights situation worsened when he came in from Sheikh Hasina. But the Netra News just wrote inflammatory articles about Sheikh Hasina and how there was so much corruption and how bad she was. And I mean, I think only some of it was true. It was exaggerated or based on, yellow journalism model, like we've seen, with the Russiagate here. We make accusations and there's not hard evidence to back it up. And then, when Yunus came in and there were pogroms going on by these Muslim gangs targeting, Hindus and non-Muslims, there was no reporting on that. And they sugarcoated his regime. They sugarcoated his past. And the information is easily available on the internet because for the articles I wrote on Bangladesh, I just had an internet. I don't, have any connection to Bangladesh. I found documentaries that I could watch on the internet that were by investigative video journalists who went to villages in Bangladesh and interviewed people about how they were conned by the Grameen Bank owned by Yunus. So Netra News are supposed to be from the country, and how come they can't report that? So and that's the difference between propaganda and real journalism. A real journalist seeks, different sides of a story and doesn't report on corruption just from one government if the next government is far more corrupt, and doesn't report on the geopolitical aspects of this regime change operation. So it's very clearly a propaganda agency, and it was funded by NED, and that's emblematic of how they cloak it as we're supporting free independent media, but they're actually funding propaganda agencies, and then to add insult that are fomenting regime change against the kind of governments you describe, and to add insult to injury, Stanford, which is a nest of these these phony professors. And this is a disgrace to American parents who pay $50,000 a year. You can look up the tuition of Stanford, $60,000, maybe $70,000. Supposedly the great humanist education at that fee, but the professors are all actually intelligence agents and propagandists, not professors. I mean, I'm trained as a professor, and we have a code that the goal is to uncover the truth, just like a real journalist. And I mean, there are many imposters, and a real scholar will spend hours in the library digging for the evidence and has to be judicious, weighing both sides of issues, and tries to promote understanding of different countries. When you have intelligence agents and NED propagandists are not real professors. They're promoting a narrative to advance a U.S. imperialistic agenda in the world. And that's not education, that's indoctrination. And that's what parents are getting when they pay $50,000 at Stanford, not to get their kids become scholars and humanists, but to be indoctrinated, because those are their professors. And they gave Netra News, they're supposed to be a great journalism school at Stanford, training the future generation of journalists. Yet they gave an award to Netra News for great journalism when it's not journalism, it's propaganda. And what message does it send to their journalism students? So this is an outrage on so many different levels. And back to my earlier point, the left was silent, the progressives, there was no activism. And in fact, the left was often trying to save these organizations that were being cut by Trump, which there was a lot of outrageous thing that Trump was cutting. But some things Trump was doing away with in the beginning, like NED, would have been good. So the progressives should have said, do away with NED, keep the aid program that actually do, fight aid or feed people, but cut those aspects that are propaganda and part of regime change. But the left, there wasn't enough activism, and they were able to restore the funding.
Are you able to hear me? Because I had some difficulty with my microphone.
Yes, I can hear you. Go.
Okay, great. It's also, when I've talked to people who are on the left about the cuts to NED, they were very concerned with NED's provision of food. And, I just want to say, I'm not quite sure what NED was providing, but quite a while ago, I did some research on UNICEF and what UNICEF was providing. And also these are the programs that I guess feed the impoverished in the United States, where you get basically a chunk of Velveeta cheese as a food ration. The stuff that they give people is not really that healthy. It's basically things that they want to get rid of, or that that has no value. The other thing is, one of the concepts that's, I think, very important that I mentioned in the monologue is kind of this trifecta. If you want to have regime change, you need a trifecta, and the trifecta is NED, CIA doing covert warfare, although, the CIA calls it covert action, but it's warfare. When you're kidnapping people, when you're killing people, when you're supplying weapons to death squads, when you're hiring contractors and criminals to block streets and throw bombs. This is not a soft coup. This is a misnomer. This is covert warfare. So if you have NED, you have the CIA doing covert warfare, and then you have the third part of the trifecta, which is very important for our audience to focus on, which are sanctions. And that's also a misnomer. What they really are is unilateral coercive measures, economic coercive measures, and these scarcity tactics are deprive people of food and medicine and things like that. So it's this combination of these three things that causes regime change in these countries. And it's not a soft coup. It's not a pleasant process. Sanctions alone cause millions of deaths. And it's through this process called lethal selection, where you're not actually killing someone with nerve gas or with a bullet or an incendiary device. You're killing them by withholding the things that they need, that humans need to survive and thrive. And what happens in these situations is that you have stunted growth in children. You have people dying from contaminated water. So basically, if you deny these, things, it's warfare, and people are dying, and it's a terrible thing. So, there's this whole thing how these things are nonviolent tactics. They are violent tactics. That's a lie. And really, NED without sanctions would be ineffective, and NED without the CIA would be ineffective. So it's really the three of these things together that are so deadly to these populations. And really, why are they doing it? Well, they tell us it's for democracy. And I think Jeremy's really great on focusing on that part of it. But it has nothing to do with democracy. It has to do with resource extraction and appropriation. And the United States, we don't benefit from this stuff, folks. You and me, Jeremy, none of us benefit from this. Okay, who benefits from this is the predator class. They benefit from this. So they tell us this is for our benefit. They tell us this is for democracy. It isn't. It's for the appropriation of these resources for a very small group of people. Thanks.
Well, I think that's accurate in general. The NED does not give food. They fund media and human rights groups, but they weaponize human rights. They target, like in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, they funded all these Ukrainian human rights groups to publicize Russian human rights abuses, to demonize Russia, to validate the war on Russia. And I think the target is in part world opinion, so that Russia is presented in the worst possible light, and so that people will support the war of aggression, what effectively is a U.S.-Ukrainian war of aggression on Russia. And the CIA has built the drone industry in Ukraine, and they're using those drones to directly attack Russian oil and gas facility to just destroy their energy industry. So the U.S., which is a leading world producer now of energy, can sell its energy to Europe. So that's the underlying agenda. But the NED is there for propaganda, to fund the human rights groups, to fund the media network. They're not real media. It's propaganda to vilify these governments, whether it's Nicaragua, Russia, China. And with regard to China, yeah, they just appointed a major China hawk to their board, and you can see the agenda group like NED when they appoint. The listeners may not be familiar with him, but John Moolenaar is a congressman from Michigan, and he's the chairman of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. And if you follow what that committee is doing, it's a relic of the McCarthy era. They're publicizing how China has supposedly infiltrated American domestic institutions. And they claim that China has infiltrated American universities, and they're driving the persecution of Chinese scientists. There was just a scientist who committed suicide because he was interrogated by FBI agents and accused of being a spy for China when he's just doing his science. And they've deported a number of scientists and accused them of crimes for allegedly importing bioterrorist weapons, when actually scientists came out and said it was part of their experiments. They just didn't file the proper paperwork, and they weren't properly instructed as to what paperwork they needed to file for these material they were bringing in for their lab work. And so they were accused of bioterrorism. And then, scientists said that the material was not dangerous at all, and it could only be used in a lab. But this guy Moolenaar was using his platform to make it seem like the Chinese Communist Party had infiltrated American universities, and there was an insidious plot to poison the American food supply. And they also blamed China for the fentanyl outbreak. And by part, Moolenaar, and there's this Democrat, Indian guy from Harvard, Raja Krishnamurthy, who's on the Democratic Party, they co-chaired a hearing where they both blamed China for the fentanyl crisis in the United States. When that crisis is the result of the breakdown in the U.S. economy, deindustrialization, and the disillusionment in a lot of youth who don't have good job prospects in rural areas and poor regions of the United States. And there's no evidence China is behind that. And China came out and said, this is ridiculous. They said this is totally false. China has some of the strongest drug laws in the world, and a lot of the fentanyl comes from Mexico. But anyway, this gives you just a flavor of that committee, just to finish, that this committee is spreading xenophobia, and now they appoint, and it's right at the 19th century yellow peril, at a time that the U.S. has this huge military buildup targeting China. Many say the war with Iran is really targeting China. They want to cut off the gas supply to China so U.S. can have a stronghold, weaken China, and then the U.S. can sell the gas to Asia and form a coalition against China. So, appointing this guy to the board is very, very emblematic of NED, the propaganda agency for warfare. And that's why it's a very dangerous organization. But go ahead, Gloria. I didn't want to cut you off.
I just have 2 points of information. First, I just want to clarify something. I'm not saying that NED distributes food. I mean, what I'm saying is that when I've asked people who are on the left or considered liberals why they are supporting NED, they're saying that they're supporting NED because NED has a role in the distribution of food.
Well, they're misinformed. Those people are misinformed.
Yeah, well, but also there's NGOs that work in community. NED does fund NGOs that work in communities that have food insecurity. I mean, there is some pipeline. It's not a direct pipeline, and it's not the core mission of NED. And also, these people are misinformed, and that's how the whole thing works. You say, oh, well, if we defund NED, then people are going to not have access to this or that. It's that thing. So the other thing I wanted to say is that when I did some research, I did find that China does supply some of the inputs that are used in the making of fentanyl. However, the issue is not that anyone makes this product. The issue is that this product gets to the United States and is distributed. There is a distribution network of fentanyl. It's illegal, but yet somehow it's distributed in the United States. And, when we've looked at distributions before, we've seen that the CIA always has a role in distribution. It knows, I mean, these things don't just show up. There's a pipeline, you know.
Yeah, well, the broader point is that they're promoting fear mongering and they're blaming China for a problem that's really rooted in domestic problem within the United States. And yeah, China supplies certain may supply some chemicals that are actually legal that could be manufactured into fentanyl. But that has nothing to do with what the committee that Mulinar is on, and this Krishnamurti is as bad as him. They're blaming China, and it's inculcating this anti-China fervor in the country. Trump blamed China for the COVID. He called it Kung Flu. And that mass, as we know, the CIA was involved with gain of function research in developing coronavirus as a bioweapon, and they try to spin it that China was to blame. And that fueled the xenophobia. I mean, there were anti-Asian hate attacks after Trump said that. And I mean, there's good reason why people on the right, see Trump as this, on the left, sorry, as a nativist, and hate him for good reason. But, the NED has a lot of Democrats, and they're doing the same thing. Krishnamurti was doing the same thing with Mulinar on this House of CCP, Select Committee on the CCP. And Ro Khanna, he's a supposed progressive hero. He's on that committee. And so it's really, both parties are doing it. And it's very dangerous. It's building this anti-China hatred, and it's mobilizing public support for a war that they're planning on China and to undermine China internationally, including through these color revolutions like in Bangladesh. And other countries, the U.S. is very active, like Philippines, building up the military bases. They're pushing militarization of Japan. South Korea, the U.S. is building its alliance with far-right governments in South Korea to build more U.S. bases there. And the left has not been opposing this at all. I mean, there's only this unilateral focus on the Israel genocide in Gaza. They miss what's going on around the world and what U.S. imperialism is doing, and the target on China, and how the NED is very vital for propaganda, including propagandizing the American public. That's why my emphasis on these NED university professors is very important, because they're insidiously distorting education in our country and indoctrinating young people in this narrative to advance U.S. imperialism. And I found these NED professors everywhere. Stanford is the worst, and they're in Canada. There's a terrible guy in Toronto, Lucan Way, who's tied with Chrystia Freeland, who's this arch Ukrainian hawk in Canada. And he was a professor in the U.S. and moved to the University of Toronto. He's a big guy at NED and promotes their narrative, but it's everywhere. But that article on the NED professors shows all the kind of well-known schools. Berkeley has these NED guys, Harvard, wherever you turn, you have these NED professors. So that's an example of how they're spreading their propaganda within the United States.
The other thing I'd like to add as a point of information is, when you said that, these programs function in a way to, they change governments essentially in developing countries and things like that because they want to put in people who are against benefits for workers and reasonable things like that. And you framed it as really a cost-saving measure by putting in militarized governments that are friendly to the United States. And I want to say something even more hideous than that. And we've noticed lethal selection and this whole movement to depopulation. And when you deny people living wages, when you deny people health care, when you deny people quality water, drinking water and food, you increase their illnesses and you increase the rate of death. So this is not just a cost-saving measure, putting these governments in place. This is also these are also techniques to kill people without using bombs and bullets. So, I think that's something to always keep in mind. They want to thin the herd. They want to kill us. And, we're seeing this again and again and again, domestically and in foreign policies.
Well, that may very well be. Yeah, it's clear that their agenda is to support right-wing governments, and they never, they claim to champion human rights, but they never take up the issue, of the right to health care, the right to good education. They target governments that do that, like the Nicaraguan government, you're saying, or the Venezuelan government, before the sanction, like Venezuela, even the New York Times acknowledged that the Chavez government, after, nationalizing the oil, and committing to using government resources to helping the poor, that the poverty rate was cut by 60% in Venezuela. I mean, I read that in the New York Times. So, and that's the kind of government they're targeting, or the quality of life. I mean, China's uplifted millions of people out of poverty, and yet we have this, massive demonization campaign against China. I mean, yeah, sure, it's not a perfect country, but governing a huge country like China, there's bound to be some injustices. And meanwhile, they've improved the quality of life for so many people, and yet they're the government of the target of this demonization. What NED does is they fund dissident, they fund Chinese dissidents, and they'll fund journals, and that's what the CIA did historically. Journals of exiles, and some of the professors are exile, like they're dissidents in their country, and they hate their own government, and they often take it too far. They might have some legitimate grievance, but then they promote this hate-filled rhetoric against their own country, and they want the U.S. to go in to bomb their own country or apply these sanctions that will spread poverty and misery. And these are the kind of people NED funds. And some of those professors in my article upcoming are exile. Like they fund this Iranian guy at Stanford who, think the Islamic regime are criminal and wants to see their removal. They funded a guy back in the 2003, and actually I knew this guy when I was a student at Brandeis University. Kanan Makia he wrote these books exposing human rights abuses by Saddam Hussein. And he was very tied with George Bush and the neoconservatives, and he was supporting the war in Iraq. And he was saying that American troops will be greeted with sweets and flowers in Iraq. But he actually hadn't lived in Iraq since the mid-1960s. He had left Iraq. He was totally out of touch with developments in Iraq. But NED funded him because he wrote a book that's demonized Saddam Hussein. And some parts of the book were accurate. I mean, Hussein did have human rights abuses, but there was an underlying agenda there. And so that's the kind of people they fund. And they funded his book project. And then how he got that probably as NED, it was how he got a tenured position at Brandeis. Now they're moving only to adjuncts, and us real scholars struggle, and they're paid poverty wages. And yet these guys who are not real scholar but propagandists get these well-paid endowed chairs at fancy school like Brandeis or Stanford. And this is an outrage. I mean, it's a betrayal of education, and that's the field I've worked in. So this really angers me. But to understand, he's vital cog to U.S. empire because he's from that country, and they can defer to him and say, "Oh, look how terrible it is. We have to go in there and save the natives." It's this attitude and rhetoric that we have to go in and save the natives from these horrible dictators.
One thing I just framed out there
in the 1920s and 30s.
One thing I just want to get out there is, when we look at Iran right now and what we're doing, the United States and Israel are targeting hospitals in Iran. They're targeting schools in Iran.
Yeah, we know about that.
They're targeting infrastructure, water desalination plants. They're targeting things that kill people. These are war crimes, folks. I mean, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to target military targets. You're not supposed to target things that kill people. So, again, this is a depopulation agenda. And it's
and related to the NED, one has to look at how they frame like with the Russia Ukraine. and it showed that they're propagandists because they never discuss Ukrainian atrocities. It's only Russian atrocities to make the public believe, and much of the public believes that. The left had been mostly silent on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. A lot of the left has supported it. A lot of the left media is promoting this, alternative media, so-called, is promoting this narrative right out of the NED playbook. And they're censoring. There are some reporters who've reported on Ukrainian atrocity. There's Eva Bartlett, who lived in eastern Ukraine, reported on a lot of atrocities committed by Ukraine, firsthand reporting. There's a guy, Patrick Lancaster, who's a U.S. naval officer who married, I think, a Russian or Ukrainian girl and took his video camera, lived there, and just showed the footage and interviewed people in eastern Ukraine who were being assaulted by the Ukrainian military and being shelled on a daily basis and forced to live in underground caves for long periods. But NED didn't publicize that. An objective reporter, they would actually report on Russian war crimes as well as Ukrainian war crimes. It's a propagandist, though, when there are independent journalists reporting something and they refuse to cite those journalists, acknowledge their work, or report on that aspect of the war. And as it turns out, the Ukrainian atrocities were far more marked in eastern Ukraine, at least from the period 2014 to before the Russian special military operation. The evidence showed, including from UN reports, that the massive shelling and war crime were coming from the Ukrainian side, and the eastern Ukraine were actually begging the Russians to intervene to protect them. And some of them were neo-Nazi forces that were committing torture. We heard from a guy who said they would go in and murder people and steal all their jewelry and think they can sell on the black market. So an honest media or honest human rights group would report on all that, and then they would have credibility if they're reporting on Russian atrocities after Russia got involved in that conflict. That would be a credible organization. What NED is funding, though, are these propaganda outlets that only focus on one side because they have a political agenda. And that's what people need to be attuned to, that a lot of the coverage of Russia, of China, is fueled by this agenda, and it's by NED funded groups that are shaping the narrative. They get in, even in our media, and they frame public perception of those conflicts to make these governments seem horrible, like in Venezuela and Latin America. They target Venezuela, and all the left-wing governments are made to look horrible, and they fund human rights groups.
I want to add a point of information.
And the left shouldn't fall into that trap, because what we find in a lot of the left alternative media falls into the trap and ends up supporting the regime change operations. And we should be able to see through that and develop a genuinely progressive movement that favors an anti-imperialist foreign policy against the kind of policy Gloria describing that caused death, the sanctions, the regime change, that bring in these horrible regressive governments. And you can look at the case of Ukraine. NED was very active before the Maidan coup. They had a more independent government, Viktor Yanukovych, who was refusing an IMF loan that would come with string that would force this austerity on the people. And then NED was funding it was mobilizing students and whipping up hatred against Yanukovych to foment this Maidan insurrection that led to a regime change operation, and that ultimately led to disaster for Ukraine. And I know a lot of the Ukrainians, they had to flee the country. And they said the extremists took over. Their country's been plunged into war and chaos and disaster. And that's what happened in Libya as well, and other countries like Syria. So progressives have to be attuned to that and see how vital NED is to the regime change operations.
I just want to say that whenever we mention Saddam Hussein, we need to clarify that he was installed. He was a U.S. asset, a CIA asset, and we had a discussion with our good friend. To
interject, that is a complex issue.
And he pushed back, and he said, "Well, Saddam Hussein isn't really a CIA asset. He was considered a liaison." And I said, the CIA has these nice words. They don't say covert warfare. They say covert action. It's warfare.
If I could interject, that is a complex.
I just want to finish the one sentence. So Okay, so Saddam Hussein is considered by the CIA not an officer or an agent, but a liaison. Liaison is such a pretty word. I was in New York City government for my career, and I worked in different areas, and I had liaisons. Like the budget department is a liaison for the procurement department, and the procurement department is a liaison for the budget department. So things are liaisons, but when you have someone who is fronting a war against its people, you know for the United States, that goes a little bit further than a liaison in my personal opinion, although we will defer to John Kiriaku's interpretation as an expert that that Saddam Hussein was a liaison. But in my
Well, that
opinion,
issue is
it's more than that.
controversial. Hussein was a pan-Arab socialist. He did have ties to the CIA going back to the 1950s, and he drove against the Communist Party. But the U.S. generally goes against he wanted to assert control over Iraq's oil and follow the model of Gamal Abdel Nasser. He wanted to be a regional strongman. And assert more, Iraqi power in the region, and that was a threat to U.S. oil interests. The U.S. wanted to install a pliable puppet, and in fact, this guy Kanan Makia was very close with Ahmed Chalabi. This NED funded scholar, Kanan Makia, was very close. Ahmed Chalabi was the guy that the U.S. had in mind to replace Saddam Hussein, and he was also an exile who was a crook. But he would, privatize Iraq's oil industry. That was the key issue. But they played up Saddam's human rights. And at various times, the agency did use him for their own purposes, like to foment a war against Iran.
Like General Noriega in Panama. I mean, these are people that are promoted by the CIA and funded by the CIA and supported by the CIA.
Well, at various times, you have to be careful with the use of the word. Well, you have to be careful with the use of the word puppet because he had a domestic base of support, and that there are complex divisions in their politics, and he also had some progressive policies, and that is what the U.S. They never trusted him. They might have used him for certain purposes at certain times, but they would turn against him. When he advanced his agenda of asserting more Iraqi power in the region and asserting more control over the oil. And it's the same with Noriega. When Noriega tried to take control over I believe the issues with the Panama Canal and, follow the treaty agreements and push the canal back into Panamanian control and move closer to Cuba and took more, asserted himself more independently. That's when they turned against him. So,
right. As long as you do your goal, they're there. The minute you step out of line, you're done. You're done.
Yeah, and people should understand the role, since we're focused on the NED today. The role of the NED is to stir up hatred against these leaders who may step out of the line, and they may not be the most savory leaders. So some of the reports that they sponsor groups, there is some credible information, but people have to learn to be able to distinguish propaganda from honest journalism that will look at various aspects of the issue, that will look at an honest journalist looks at the underlying geopolitical agenda and calculation. He compared this leader with other leaders who may be equally or worse, more corrupt that the U.S. wants to install. The propagandist just demonizes and vilifies that leader without a proper context for his emergence in power, and without analyzing the U.S. interest and agenda. And that's what you get with the NED. And they're very effective in shaping public discourse. Let's be honest, that they are very effective. They mobilize exile groups quite effectively. They're able to bring people together in these color revolutions. They spread their propaganda on a worldwide basis and within the United States, and because they get these human rights groups are quoted in media articles. That's the way they do it. They're not directly funding our media, but they're funding like human rights groups in Iran that are, publicizing, like with the huge number allegedly killed in those protests to set the groundwork for the U.S. bombing. you had the media quoting these NED-funded groups who were inflating the numbers and not really giving an accurate portrayal of those protests and how they may have been fomented by outsiders. And then there's the professors I was describing, and they have this academic journal. It's under the veneer of a serious scholarly journal of democracy, and they look like scholarly article with footnotes, but it's really propaganda. And all their writers and editorial board members are strategically placed in universities across the United States, and it's part of their propaganda. And the CIA is barred from carrying out propaganda, but we see, and they're barred from infiltrating. They're not supposed to intervene in domestic politics in any way, and they set up front groups like the NED so they can violate that charter, and that's what the American public should be alarmed about. Our public, our fabric is to have a free education system, and the education system is supposed to be separate from the government and to cultivate independent thinking and more humanist education. And this is the exact opposite. So this should be an alarm for every single American, whether they're left, right, it doesn't matter. It's a betrayal of the American education system and American Constitution.
Without question. How are we doing on time there? Let's take a look.
Well, another issue could be addressed is the issue of religious freedom. The reason they appointed there's Sam Brownback, I had an article. They appointed the former governor of Kansas, and he advanced what you were describing, these austerity measures in foreign countries that deprive people of education, of health care, that cut the funding for public services. He applied that in the state of Kansas. It was known as the Kansas experiment of Sam Brownback, and he was the most unpopular governor in Kansas history because that right-wing agenda cut basic services. They had to move to a 4-day school day, and they replicated this in Oklahoma, where I lived, under Governor Mary Fallin and Kevin Stitt. And Oklahoma ranks 50th in education in the country. This has been a failed system. That the teachers were so poorly paid. Huge number of teachers moved to Texas or Arkansas, where they can get neighboring states where they can actually make reasonable wages compared to Oklahoma and Kansas, because they cut the funding for education to the bone under this austerity model. Cut taxes. It's this libertarian model of government of cut taxes, favored by big business that supposedly will stimulate business growth and new investment if the rich don't have to pay as much in tax. But you cut the taxes, you have to cut your public services, including education and health care, and it led to crisis in the education system, both in Kansas and Oklahoma, where they applied this. And then they appoint him to the NED board. So these are the kind of people they're promoting, who support the austerity, extreme right-wing government systems. And then he's supposedly the spokesman for religious freedom. But what I point out in my article is that, he's very selective. If he really cared about, and he was involved, like with China, there's some priests who said they were persecuted in China because the government didn't authorize their church, and he was given a jail sentence. Although the pastor who they spotlighted was pictured with George W. Bush in 2004, was like hugging George W. Bush, and seems to have been tied with like elite politicians in Washington. So that may have been why he was on the radar of the Chinese government. They probably saw him as like a foreign agent. So it's not clear if that was an issue of religious persecution. Now, if it was, fine, but the hypocrisy that, in Ukraine, for instance, it's been reported how the Ukrainian government has basically persecuting the Russian Orthodox Church, and has even taken over some churches. We had a guest who talked about that. So if the NED were a legitimate organization that genuinely concerned about religious freedom around the world, they would broadcast what's going on in Ukraine or in Syria. The Islamic fundamentalist government that the CIA supported in a major regime change operation, and NED contributed significantly to the empowerment of this Muslim extremist government that has attacked Christian churches. But NED does not publicize that as a violation of religious freedom. There have been pogroms against Christians and other minority groups in Syria by this Muslim extremist government. But since they're allied with the U.S. Empire's interests, they don't publicize that. Only supposed abuses going on in China. So it showed their agenda. But again, they have a lot of influence in shaping public discourse worldwide, and people will associate political persecution with the communist government in China, and they're involved in publicizing that, not with what's going on in Ukraine or Syria.
We're running out of time. Jeremy, could you please tell our audience how they can follow your work?
Well, this series for the NED was developed for Covert Action Magazine, which tries to spotlight or expose covert operations or abuse of U.S. intelligence agencies. And there's a running series on the NED. I try and monitor the NED, and have written about 10 articles at least about the NED for Covert Action Magazine and on my Substack. And I'll have one coming out in August about the NED professors for, back to school special about how they're penetrating U.S. higher education.
Well, the opinions you hear are ours, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. That wraps up our show for today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov. Remember to like and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Please find us on Substack, Twitter X, and Podbeam. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
Okie doke.
Okay. Oh, we didn't show the video, but
I know. I was going to ask, would you like to cue it up and talk about it real quick?
You want to do it now?
All right, let's just finish with that. Yeah, I have to leave in 5 or 10 minutes, but yeah, let's finish with that segment.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, you guys set it up, and I'll bring up the video.
It's in the chat.
Well, I've got it ready.
Yeah,
you got to set it up.
Video, and then we'll finish with the commentary about that.
Oh yeah, okay. Just open up what the video is of. Jeremy.
Yeah. What is the video about?
The video is the NED director, Damon Wilson, was testifying before Congress, and he basically admitted that the NED was involved in stirring up protests in Iran to try and trigger a crackdown that can make the Iranian government look bad, and then justify U.S. Israeli intervention that would be seemingly for humanitarian reasons, to save the natives. It's this colonial framework, and we have to save the natives from these horrible governments. They can't govern themselves. We have to install governments for them.
All right, let's take a look.
Mr. Chair, that we just got a notification that the State Department is actually funding a new program to, I guess, with Starlink. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Can you explain that?
I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of the State Department, but what I would share is that we've been investing in communication tools over years that allow for information to be sent into Iran, even when internet connectivity is blocked. We specifically began supporting the deployment, the operation of about 200 Starlinks early on.
All right, you know what? I'm going to interrupt you. We better not talk about it. Okay, so I believe.
Okay, yeah, you could end there. Well, I mean, yeah, now that she quickly shut it down, but I mean, they're infiltrating a foreign country to foment unrest. And I mean, then they have I think they attack these governments. They say, oh, they're so authoritarian. And, because Russia passed a law, I think, barring the NED, and they passed laws against U.S. NGOs because these NGOs are not really humanitarian organizations. They're there to foment civil unrest and regime change. And then they use those laws as an example of how authoritarian these governments supposedly are. But meanwhile, they're trying to protect their country's sovereignty from NED and related groups that are trying to stir unrest. And, this clearly is an admission of that. And then they have to shut down the conversation, but they're trying to broadcast messages and through a sophisticated satellite system and stir up opposition groups and to engage in protests, often violent protests that they know will engender a crackdown. And they can, it's all about an information war and perception. So if the government then steps in to suppress what are violent uprisings, then they can say, oh, look at this horrific dictatorship. But they're massacring their own people. We have to go in and save them. This colonial rhetoric. Often they're false flag. They set up the government. Not only do they deliberately get them to react to protests, they actually stage snipers to kill the protesters and then blame the government. And that's what they did in Ukraine, and it's been documented. Ivan Kachanovsky wrote a very detailed scholarly study on the Maidan coup, and he showed, I think, beyond any reasonable doubt, even drawing on a trial that occurred in Ukraine over a decade later, that these were paid government agents. Some were Georgians, some were CIA operatives, and some were far right-wing neo-Nazis in Ukraine who fired on the protesters, and they set it up to make it look like Yanukovych did the firing to make him look like the bad guy and to facilitate a regime change.
And if it's not the NED doing it, it's probably USAID or another NGO that's going out there pretending to
sometimes they will work together
and set them up
and do some of the same kinds of things. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that'll do it for today. You guys ready to wrap it up?
We're ready.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
let's see if we can figure out what happened to my mic also.
Yeah, we'll have to fix that. I mean, we got a bit of a late start because of that, but I think it went well once everything started working.
Yeah.
So thanks to everybody who's been watching at home. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. Thanks to Craig Pasta Jardula. He's executive producer of this show. And we'll be back next week with another episode. Hopefully won't have technical issues. That's 2 weeks in a row now. But it's still good content, and the radio is working out pretty well for us. So we'll be back again.
And your editing skills are fantastic.
Well, I put a lot of work into that.
The last episode, you really cleaned it up beautifully.
Yeah, we were short last week. We were short about 2 minutes, so I had to work some magic. Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week, and have a good one, everybody. Take care.
This